Yes, indeed, we are going to be talking about this very special event that I can't believe is only going to be 3 weeks from today. Um, I must tell you that when I was a very young boy, I remember watching TV, CBS to be exact. They had special coverage back then in 1970 of a solar eclipse, and one of my mentors to astronomy, Dr. Kenneth Franklin, who at the time was the assistant chairman of the Hayden Planetarium, was talking with Charles Kuralt, the late great newscaster Charles Kuralt. And Charles Kuralt said, I understand there's going to be a very good eclipse coming up in April in the year 2024. And Dr. Franklin said, oh, yes. And he expounded to a degree on that. And remember, this is 1970. He's talking about an event that's going to be 54 years in the future. After he talked about it, mentioned it, and the specifics, Charles Kuralt said, well, that's a rather long time to wait, 54 years. And Dr. Franklin said, well, that's unfortunate, but that's the way the things are in the astronomy world sometimes. You have to sometimes go after these events, they don't come to you. And again, I remember that so clearly. That was in 1970. And I cannot believe now that here we are 3 weeks away from that date, April the 8th, 2024. And while, yes, you will be able to see the eclipse from Westchester County, yes, you will see a substantial amount of the sun covered. 91% is going to be covered as seen from here in the tri-state area at 3:25 that afternoon. But I would like to urge all of you to make plans to be out of the New York area and try to position yourself in the zone of the total eclipse. That is where the main show is going to be. Totality. That is something that everybody in their life should see at least once before departing to a different sector of the universe. Um, Comparing a partial eclipse of the sun to a total eclipse is like having, well, let's say you decided to go to the Super Bowl, but you didn't have any tickets. Oh, yeah, you can take your car, you can travel and drive into the parking lot, but that's about the best that you're going to be able to do. You'll be outside of the stadium. You'll be able to hear the cheers of the crowd, I'm sure, from outside, but you won't be able to be inside. If you have tickets, obviously you get the full effect of being in a seat, being able to see the game, making chit chat with your fellow football fans in there, and be able to order food or whatever like that. The whole 9 yards if you're inside the ballpark. But if you're outside, what can you do? What can you see? You can just say that you're near, but you're not in. That's pretty much the situation with a partial eclipse like what we're going to see in Westchester versus a total eclipse. And here in New York State, the event will be total in Niagara Falls, in Buffalo, in Rochester, Syracuse, Watertown, Plattsburgh. You're only really by car about 4 hours away from totality. I mean, there's some scientists who will travel halfway around the world to see one of these events for a few minutes to stand in the shadow of the moon. And look what you have. All you have to do is travel a few hours away and you'll be in totality. And people come up to me and say, well, really, Joe, is it worth it? Is it worth spending a few extra dollars? Is it worth the time and effort to get into the zone of total eclipse? And I tell them, yes, yes, because when you see it for your first time, and I'm sure many of you have never seen one before, if you see it for the first time, you are going to remember those moments, even though it may last 3 or 4 minutes at most for totality. You're going to remember those moments for the rest of your life. What I'm about to talk to you about are the adventures that I have had. As was noted, Lisa has mentioned that I've seen 13 total eclipses, and I've traveled literally around the world to see them. I'm not going to go through all 13. If I did, but we'd be here until like 10 o'clock tonight. But what I will do is we're going to talk about the ones that stand out, at least in my life and in my memory. And so this is a PowerPoint program. So I'm going to share the screen with you now. Let's do that. And again, this is going to be a slideshow, PowerPoint slideshow. And we'll start from the beginning. And again, I want to thank the three sponsoring libraries for this talk tonight: the New Rochelle Public Library, the John C. Hart Memorial Library in Yorktown Heights, and the Ossining Public Library. All three libraries are bringing this particular talk to all of you. And the talk again is Adventures of an Eclipse Chaser. And I'm again your narrator for this evening, or storyteller, if you will, Joe Rayo. Well, I have, as I said, seen a number of these eclipses, and who among us would not marvel at the spectacle of a total eclipse? No spectacle that nature has to offer can rival a total eclipse of the sun for sheer drama and excitement. It's not just something you see, it's something that those of you who have been to eclipses have come to realize it is an experience. Every fiber of you becomes involved during those precious moments of totality. And of course, at the very beginning and the very end, we have those remarkably beautiful diamond ring effects that grace our skies. They become indelibly implanted into our memories, and they remain a lifetime once we have been there where the shadow of the moon strikes the earth. Now, I again have seen a number of these. My last eclipse expedition was in December of 2021, and next to me you see my very best friend, and she is my very best friend in spite of the fact that on September 1st we will be celebrating our 40th year of wedded bliss. That's my wife, Renata, and you see we're bundled up to a degree, and there's good reason, because the place where we witnessed or experienced our last total eclipse was Antarctica, literally the bottom of the world. You see how crazy I am to go to all these places to try to get a glimpse of a total eclipse. Off to one side, you can see the eclipse patch on my Parker here, and over here you can see lounging in the sun. It was a relatively warm day. It was, again, December is the start of summer in the southern hemisphere. You could see a sea lion basking in the sunshine. It was only about 30 degrees that day, rather warm for Antarctica. And I've seen eclipses also from other perspectives, like from the shipboard, the deck of a ship. This image was taken a few minutes after sunrise. This was probably the most unusual sunrise I've ever seen, of a total eclipse that occurred a few hundred miles off the coast of Nova Scotia. This was August 11th, 1999. And there you see the beginning of totality. It only lasted for 50 seconds, but it was gorgeous. And you see the beginning of the total phase with, again, a beautiful diamond ring effect. This gentleman, rather distinguished indeed, is Professor Charles A. Young, and he was an astronomer who lived in the late 19th century. And on August the 7th of 1869, in Burlington, Iowa, he brought his prism spectroscope with him. Professor Young positioned himself in the path of a total eclipse of the sun, his very first total eclipse, I will add, and he was hoping to discover with his spectroscope what the corona was composed of. He had with him his assistant, William Harkness, and he handed Professor Young a lantern to read the micrometer head moments after the total phase hit him, because it can get rather dark when the sun is completely covered during the total phase of the eclipse. So here's William Harkness. He hands the lantern to Professor Young, and then he looks up into the sky at the totally eclipsed sun, and he suddenly exclaimed, "Oh my God, look at that!" And after the eclipse was over, and after Professor Young took records and wrote in his journal, he said, "I looked over my shoulder for just an instant and beheld the most beautiful and most impressive spectacle upon which my eyes ever rested. It couldn't have been more than 5 seconds, but the effect was so overwhelming as to drive away all certain recollections of what I had just seen. I cannot describe the sensation of surprise and mortification, of personal imbecility and wasted opportunity that overwhelmed me when the sunlight flashed out. So I can only assume that Professor Young became so emotionally overwrought that it may have produced a sort of paralysis. I can visualize this old man just staring absolutely transfixed, and down the drain probably went many days and many weeks of preparations and dry runs. That's what happens when you are exposed to a total eclipse of the sun. It happens with people of all ages. I know it happened with this young man. In fact, the young man that you see on your screen now is the same person who's speaking to you 60 years later. It's a picture of me back in 1963. You can see that big clunker behind me. And in 1963, I saw an eclipse of the sun, and I was introduced to eclipses by my grandfather, who told me on a summer Saturday afternoon in July 20th, 1963, that we were going to see an eclipse later that day. And I said to him, "Well, what's an eclipse?" And he took the salt and pepper shaker off the shelf of the kitchen, put them on the kitchen table, made a fist, and said, "This is what's going to happen." It was my first lesson in celestial mechanics. My fist is the sun. The salt shaker is the moon. The pepper shaker is the planet we live on, the Earth. And later today, the salt shaker, or the moon in this case, is going to come between us and the sun and will block out a large part of the sun, and we are going to be witnessing a solar eclipse. Well, that day, it was very special. A lot of people getting excited about the impending eclipse. Here you see a bunch of kids who are making projection boxes so that they could safely watch the eclipse. Some of them had a telescope. Others looked at the eclipse using exposed pieces of dark film. You may remember what film is. So many people today is using their iPhones to take pictures, but back then, of course, we had something called cameras, and film that was used to be exposed inside the cameras. And if you expose the film to bright light, the negatives would come out dark, and you could use those to look at the sun directly. Or you could do what these kids were doing, projecting the image through a pinhole on one side of the box, and the other side you can see the projected image of the sun and get a view of the eclipse. Now, I was watching this eclipse with my grandparents at my grandparents' house in Throgs Neck in the Bronx, and I must tell you that on the day of the eclipse, it was very cloudy. But when we were approaching the maximum of the eclipse, as you can see, we're doing that here in this film, the clouds thinned and parted and allowed for us to see through the clouds a view of a crescent sun in the sky. Again, about 90% of the sun was covered on this day from New York. It was a partial eclipse, but I got to tell you, even as a 7-year-old, looking up into the sky, a sky filled with clouds, and seeing the crescent image of the sun was amazing to me. And it was amazing, as you can see by this newspaper article headline, to many New Yorkers who saw what, in their opinion, was a spectacular view as the clouds parted. When we went to dinner after the eclipse, I was, as my grandmother would refer to me as, a little chatterbox. I still couldn't believe it. I said, "Grandpa, that was so great. Oh my goodness." And my grandfather said, "You know, we made a mistake today. We shouldn't have stayed in the Bronx. We should have gone to Maine. Because in Maine, that state, it was the only U.S. state in the contiguous U.S. that was touched by the dark shadow of the moon, the umbra. And anywhere in this dark band, which was about 60 miles wide, anywhere in that band would have seen a total eclipse of the sun. The sun would have been completely covered by the disk of the moon." My grandfather spoke from experience. When he was 16 in January of 1925, the path of a total eclipse passed over New York City. And as you can see from the banner headline on the front page of the New York Times, the entire city halted to gaze upward. It was a spectacular, a brilliant show that was seen from land, sea, and air, thrilling the millions. And my grandfather remembered that very well. He saw it from the East River Drive. Well, of course, today we call it the FDR Drive, but it was a spectacular sight. And at dinner in 1963, after we had witnessed the partial eclipse, my grandfather turned to me and said, "The next time we're close to a path of a total eclipse, I promise that I'm going to take you to see that event." And it turned out 9 years later that there was just such an eclipse. It didn't occur in the United States, but close enough. It occurred in Quebec, Canada. Here you see Montreal. We took The eclipse was on July the 10th, 1972. So on July the 8th, my grandfather loaded me, my sister, my mom, his wife, my grandmother, in his beat up Plymouth Fury, and we traveled up along Interstate 87 across the New York border to Montreal. You see it there. And then the next day, the 9th of July, we traveled to Quebec City. And then on the morning of July the 10th, we took a 5 hour trip up along the Gaspé Peninsula, along the St. Lawrence Seaway to the little town of Cap Chat in Quebec to see this solar eclipse. And here you see my grandfather holding his exposed piece of dark film. They're looking up at the sky at the sun, and my grandmother is there with him. Now, this sequence that you see here was not taken by me. It was taken by somebody who was going to become one of my very dearest and oldest friends. His name is Glenn Schneider. We'll introduce you to him in a few moments. Glenn also went to Cap Chat, just like my family did, but as we later determined, Glenn was probably about 600 yards or so away from where I was. We had set up outside of the town of Cap Chat. And by the way, Cap Chat, if you want to get an idea what kind of a town it is, it was very much like the mythical town of Mayberry in the Andy Griffith Show. Picture, if you will, Mayberry, and then picture everybody in Mayberry talking French. That pretty much was Cap Chat, a town of about 2,000 people, overrun by about 30,000 that day from people from all over the world congregating there to get a view of the total solar eclipse. These photographs were taken again by my friend Glenn. But notice, if you will, that besides the moon covering the sun, something else was covering the sun. Clouds. As the eclipse progressed, a bank of clouds came up from the south of us, and as time wore on, more and more of the sun was being obscured not just by the moon but by the cloud cover. And this picture in the lower right-hand corner of the 6 was the last picture that Glenn was able to take of the sun before this thick cloud came in and over and covered up the sun just at the critical moment of total eclipse. So Glenn was skunked that day in Cap Chat. And as for me, well, the same cloud obliterated the sun at the start of the 2-minute total eclipse, but for me, I was a little bit luckier. The sun was able to skim outside of the cloud, and the last 90 seconds, we had a view of totality. There's this, you see the darkened disk of the sun behind the moon, the beautiful corona, which is always there, but you never see it because the blindingly bright image of the sun obliterates it. But when the sun is completely covered, the corona flashes out into view. A beautiful sight, the solar or the celestial image of a lifetime. And even the most stodgy astronomers, when they see the corona, speak of it in awe. And again, in 3 weeks, if you decide to travel outside of Westchester County and into the zone of totality, you, along with millions of others, will get the rare opportunity to see it for yourself. So I was lucky. I saw it. Glenn got clouded out, as I said. After the eclipse was over, here's a young man who was very, very happy. Like his grandfather, I too was 16 when I saw and witnessed my very first total eclipse. Now you see me wearing my official eclipse t-shirt. Of course, we were in French Quebec, so it was Eclipse de Soleil. And it was a wondrous and beautiful and memorable sight that I will always remember. I've seen, as I said, 13, but you never forget your first. It's like your first kiss. Now, what about my friend Glenn, who got skunked? Well, he and I got to know each other 6 months later. You see, the Hall of Science, that was one of the exhibits left over from the 1964-65 New York World's Fair. The Hall of Science had just obtained in 1973 a planetarium. And so we, Glenn and myself, not knowing each other, ended up volunteering, going to the Hall of Science and volunteering to work on weekends at the planetarium at the Hall of Science. And that's how we got to know each other. And it's amazing. We were both Bronx boys, and we lived within several miles of each other, although we never knew it until we met at the Hall of Science. Also, we were enthusiastic amateur astronomers with a special affinity for the phenomenon of eclipses. In fact, both of us were turned on to eclipses by our grandfathers. who were both immigrants to this great country. My Italian grandfather was Mario. Glenn's Jewish grandfather was Max, and Mario and Max were witnesses to that 1925 eclipse in New York and conveyed its beauty and grandeur to their grandsons. And interestingly, Mario and Max were both born on the very same day, Thursday, December 17th, 1908. In fact, I more than a few occasions asked Glenn, "Are you sure that we're not related in some way? Or perhaps, if anything else, it seemed like we were joined at the hip." Anyway, in 1977, Glenn called me on the phone and said, "How would you like to try to see the next total eclipse of the sun?" I knew that 1977 eclipse, which would be in October, would not be visible from the United States. In fact, it was going to be visible from a foreign land, from Colombia in South America. Here you see the path of the total eclipse between these two green lines. The capital city of Colombia was Bogota, and just to the north, in the wild and woolly country north of the cosmopolitan city of Bogota, in Cundinamarca, was where the eclipse was going to be total. I said to Glenn, I said, "Well, yeah, I'd like to see it, but how do you expect the two of us to go?" And he said, "It's easy. We'll run a tour. We'll have a tour to see the total eclipse in Colombia." Now, I had never run a tour before, and neither did he, but it sounded simple enough. The two of us knew a lot about astronomy. We knew certainly a lot about eclipses. Why couldn't we run a tour? And in fact, if we were able to convince or coerce or cajole enough people, we'd get a reduced cost on the trek down to South America. Maybe even if we get enough people, we'd both be able to go for free. Well, that didn't happen, but we were able to go at a reduced cost. And here we are. Here are your tour guides. We managed to convince 20 people to come along with us to Colombia, South America. And the demographic of those 20 people, the average age, I would say, were somewhere in the uh, uh, late 40s or 50s. We even had a couple of women who were close to 80 years old. Can you imagine if you signed on for a tour and then you ended up at the airport seeing your tour guides and seeing these two as the two people who are going to lead you into a foreign country? The two of us were tykes, tiny tykes. We were both 21 years old. And in fact, Glenn would be celebrating his 22nd birthday on the day of the eclipse, October 12th, 1977. Columbia, Columbus Day in Colombia was a national holiday, and everybody in Colombia was excited about the impending solar eclipse. Here was our bus, and one thing we learned a lot, Glenn and I, from this eclipse tour. Among other things, you should find out a lot about the equipment that you're going to use. This bus, for example, on more than one occasion broke down uh, during the course of our tour. It looks pretty nice from the outside, but on the inside, well, let's put it this way: it was very tempestuous in the way it ran. Here you see yours truly, and as I said, people. We traveled north of Bogota and passed through a number of small Colombian villages. People were aware of the eclipse, and we were telling people about it and showing people and demonstrating how they could use dark photographic film to look at the sun directly during the eclipse. This view that you see here was taken from the town of Subachoque in Colombia. And right here, this gentleman that you see here, that my cursor is indicating to all of you, this gentleman's name was Tomas, and he was our bus driver. It was right about this time, en route to the eclipse path, the spot in the eclipse totality zone where we had chosen in advance to go to, on a paved road, I might add, that Tomas came up to us and said to us, Glenn and myself, "Hey, senors," he said, I think I know how you say a shortcut, a quicker way to get to where you want to go. If you're interested, I can take you there." And Glenn and I, of course, we didn't know any better when we figured this guy knew what he was talking about. So we told Tomas, he said, "Okay, sure, that sounds great, Tomas. So, yeah, take the shortcut and we'll get to where we want to be." a lot quicker for and get a chance to set up our equipment well in advance of the eclipse. Well, the one thing that Tomas didn't tell us was that he hadn't been on that road for about 7 years, and in the 7 years since he was last on that road, the road got kind of beat up. First of all, it was an unpaved road, and mostly was made of dirt with lots of rocks in it, lots of a few rather large potholes, and going on that road, I almost said to myself, I wish I had taken Dramamine with me. We were bouncing around so much. But also, while we were on that unpaved dirt road, we encountered a tropical shower. Now, I know many of you may have been in the summertime caught in a heavy downpour or drownpour. This particular, you've not experienced rain until you've been in a tropical downpour. It came down, it boomed on down. Tremendous amount of rain in a very short interval of time. Well, what do you think is going to happen if you're on a dirt, unpaved road and encounter a tremendous downpour of rain? Right, you're going to end up with a dirt road that turns into mud. And very quickly, our bus became stuck in the mud. And not only that, we had to employ the people who paid for our tour to get out of the bus in the mud and help Tomas to push the bus out of the mud. And the fact is that we couldn't go any further on the road. It was so muddy. Tomas had to negotiate to turn the bus around. And so slowly but surely, we had to make our way back to the most recent little village, which was El Rosal. Thankfully, one of the merchants there helped us out. He said we'd go in the back of his store and clean up, which is what we did. But then the realization that the eclipse was at hand and was going to begin very shortly. So we got back on the original paved road that were on before we listened to Tomas, and we were not able to get to the spot where we wanted to be. We were going to be off the center line of the eclipse. So instead of getting a 55-second total eclipse, we were going to get more like 38 seconds of totality. And here you see when the sun started to get covered by the moon, when the moon first started to move in on the sun. This view was of one of the participants in our tour. This gentleman's name was Alden Wells from Sturbridge, Massachusetts. And here he's pointing to the one patch of blue sky. That's all we had at the beginning of the eclipse, was a patch of blue to work on. But as the minutes passed after we took this photograph, from that patch of blue got larger and larger very, very quickly. And in fact, 20 minutes later, I would say the sky was about 75 or 80% clear, sunny. And here's a view of Glenn with his telescope projecting the image of the sun onto a piece of cardboard. He's pointing out, I think, a sunspot. But it looked for all the world like we are actually going to be able to see this eclipse. In spite of the heavy rain, in spite of the cloud cover at the very beginning of the eclipse, we were heading now toward totality, and we were looking forward to seeing this grand and glorious event. But then, 5 minutes or so before totality, one lone cloud, I describe it as kind of like the Goodyear blimp, slowly but surely encroaching upon the sun, a thin crescent by then, covering the crescent up, and during the 38 seconds of totality, this was the view that we had of the eclipse. You could see that the clouds are kind of pinkish on one edge here. That is the pink color of the chromosphere, the zone that is immediately surrounding the surface of the sun, the photosphere. And then there's the pinkish or reddish chromosphere, and the light from the chromosphere was causing the edge of the cloud to light up kind of a pinkish red color. But the sun itself was behind the cloud for the 38 seconds of totality, and so we missed out on seeing the eclipse that day, the total phase of the eclipse. And then after totality was over, the cloud moved on, the sun came back out nice and shiny. Here's something we didn't expect to see. As the sun was setting behind a distant radio tower, we were able to watch as the sun set while still in partial eclipse. Oh, this was an interesting, in fact, a rather beautiful sight. It would have been the icing on the cake if we had seen totality. But unfortunately for us, the cake fell flat. And so if, all I can tell you is it was a very quiet bus ride back to the hotel in Bogota. And after we got back to the United States, we were still licking our wounds, so to speak, from missing out on this grand sight of a total eclipse of the sun. But 2 years later, another opportunity presented itself, which we called Blackout 79, a total eclipse of the sun that was going to be visible in our part of the world, our country, the United States. This one was going to start over the Pacific Ocean. It would then go across into the Pacific Northwest of the US, the Northern Plains, and then continue on up into Canada. Since I was a meteorologist, Glenn said, why don't you look up weather records and find what part of the United States, part of the eclipse track, has the best weather prospects for seeing the eclipse? And that's what I did. You see here the path of the eclipse, which passed over Montana and North Dakota on up into Canada. And I chose, based upon the best weather conditions and also a compromise about the best roads, uh, the town of Lewistown, right in the middle of Montana, big sky country, if you will. And Glenn and I once again put together a tour. This time, we didn't coerce 20 people, we actually coerced 80 people. And we needed not one bus, but two. And we, in advance of the eclipse, about a year in advance, we contacted the newspaper in Lewistown, Montana, and told them what we were planning to do. We're planning to bring this big group of people from New York to their hometown of Lewistown to see a total eclipse of the sun. And in fact, we even went so far as to declare Lewistown, Montana, the eclipse capital of the world. Well, as you can imagine, Lewistown's a rather small town in the middle of Montana, and so when they put this on the front page of their newspaper a year before the eclipse, this is in March of 1978, they were excited and made a lot of plans in advance for this grand event that was going to be coming their way in February 26, 1979. When we arrived in Montana, we went first to Great Falls, where we met with the head of the MIC, the meteorologist in charge of the National Weather Service in Great Falls, Montana, William Rammer. I might point out that Mr. Rammer just recently passed away at the age of 96. This was in 1979, though. This was 45 years ago. You see me there listening to Mr. Rammer as he was giving the weather outlook, and we would stay in contact with the Weather Service all through our stay in Lewistown to get the latest weather updates. This person who's next to me in the purple shirt is Keith Eichner, and Keith was a meteorologist as well. And you're going to hear Keith's voice in a little bit in describing the eclipse. But we stayed in contact with the Weather Service. The night before the eclipse, I gave a talk to everybody at the hotel. We stayed at a place called the Yogo Inn. And so not only did we have the 80 people from our group, but also other people, townspeople, crowding in to hear the explanation about the eclipse and the latest forecasts from the Weather Service as to where we were going to go. We planned to go and set up the next morning for the eclipse at the Quality Seed Factory, a huge field, which would certainly be large enough to accommodate all of our equipment for the eclipse. However, later that night, I got an update from Mr. Rammer at the Weather Service that indicated that a cloud system from the west was approaching and could very well arrive just as the eclipse was beginning in Lewistown. So I told Glenn, who you see on the left, middle, you could see his girlfriend, Susan. I said, Glenn, we could have a problem. I think maybe we ought to move off to the east away from the clouds that are approaching from the west. Glenn agreed. And so at the crack of dawn the next morning, we loaded our two buses, and take note of the fact that our buses this time were much better, more reliable than the buses we had in Colombia. So 80 people climbed on board, and we headed to the east. We traveled about an hour and a half outside of Lewistown to the east, and what we were looking for now was a place where we could set up our equipment. We found a huge field off to one side of the road. I think it was Route 200. And on that field, we saw a barn and a farmhouse And so we stopped our two buses, and Glenn got out of his bus, and I got out of mine, and we walked up to the front door of the farmhouse, knocked on the door, and the gentleman who opened the door, you should have seen the look on his face, because it's not every day that you see two busloads of people parked in front of his home. And Glenn did the talking. He said, "Excuse me, sir, we're here from New York, and we're here to see and observe the eclipse of the sun, which is going to begin literally any moment now. We'd like to know if we could use your field to set up our equipment." Well, he was very, very nice. The gentleman's name was Artie, and Artie said, "You mean you people came all the way from New York to see the eclipse, and you want to set up on my land? Go right ahead. Go right ahead, no problem. It'd be a different story, mind you, if it were July and August, but right now I don't have anything growing out on that field except for sagebrush, snow, and grass." So we turned around. Glenn gave a thumbs up to his bus. I gave a thumbs up to mine. And immediately, and you never saw 80 people pile out of two buses quickly, so quickly, and very quickly indeed. We set up our cameras, our telescopes, our binoculars, our tripods, all sorts of equipment. Here you see us watching as the moon started its trek in front of the sun. And there you see me with a big smile on my face. The clouds were left behind to our west. And now we were getting ready for totality. We're getting ready to see this spectacular show. Now, what you're about to see are photographs from the total phase of the eclipse. And what you're going to hear are the people from our tour group. And you're going to hear especially Keith Eichner. You saw him. He was with me at the Weather Service office with Mr. Rammer, and he is trying to stay calm, cool, and collected while he is going to narrate the gradual diminishing of the sun during the eclipse. We're going to start the recording right here, 2 minutes before totality, and you can see the giant, dark lunar shadow getting ready to envelop us, coming in from the west. And you'll hear now Keith's narration. You'll also hear in the background this, what sounds like a clicking or modulating tone. That is the shortwave radio station WWV, which is providing us with precise times so that we can time out when the eclipse is going to reach total and how long the eclipse is going to last during totality. But now here is Keith describing for you and for everybody the oncoming lunar shadow and the impending total eclipse.
It is getting spooky. It does look like a storm gathering now off to the west. It's a thin crescent, about 98% now. I got a microphone here if you want it. Here we are. 1% before totality now. 1 minute before totality or less. Got it? Okay. Oh, these are unbelievable. Oh my God, I don't believe this. This is unreal. Look at this, Bailey's feet. We got Bailey's feet. Oh yeah, we got it. Oh, that's beautiful. Look at the glow in the sky. You can see that the shadow is elliptical shape. Well, don't worry about it. Shit, I forgot to start mine.
Oh, look at the prominences. Anybody with binoculars, look at the prominences. They're absolutely fantastic. Look at the red all around. Look at the red. Oh, my God, look at the silhouette of the sky.
Oh, I got to see another one. This is unreal. They're kind of pretty gone.
4, 3, 2, 1. All right. 3 cheers for the eclipse.
Well, you can see a lot of people were happy during the 2 minutes and 30 seconds of total eclipse. A couple of guys grabbed me, put me on their shoulder, and took me all around the field, because I was the one indeed who made the last minute decision to get us out of the way of the clouds. And so we had a clear view. And Glenn and I, we avenged 2 years earlier in Colombia. This was the view of the two of us at the celebratory dinner that we had back in Great Falls that evening. One person who saw the eclipse but was not part of our group was this gentleman who I'm sorry to say passed away a year ago. He was, I suppose, Canada's most noteworthy astronomer. I guess you can call him the Neil deGrasse Tyson of Canada. His name was Terence Dickinson, and I knew Terry from his days as editor of a magazine, a short-lived magazine, Star and Sky. I used to write for that magazine, and he was well known for writing many astronomy books, and also well known for his reputation for being a rather noteworthy astrophotographer, taking pictures of stars and planets and galaxies. And on this occasion, 1979, he had planned to photograph his very first total solar eclipse. And he wrote later on that I was totally unprepared, he said, for the awesome beauty and overwhelming power of a total eclipse. I was overwhelmed, incapable of performing even the most rudimentary tasks. He said, I immediately knew that I would never be able to photograph the event. It was commanding me to use every second of viewing time to let my eyes soak up the image. I wrenched the camera off of my telescope and quickly slipped an eyepiece into the focuser and gazed on what was the most stunning and awesomely beautiful astronomical image that I have ever seen. And it's for this reason that I tell first-timers not to try to bother photographing their first total eclipse. Rather, I think what you should do is just let it sweep over you. Spend those precious moments drinking it all in with your eyes, binoculars, or a telescope. Glenn told me at his very first eclipse in 1970, he had a pair of binoculars hanging around his neck, but he was so overwhelmed by the sight of that eclipse that during that 2.5 minutes of totality, he never used them, believe it or not. My next eclipse in 1990, and you wouldn't expect, I never would have expected that I was going to see this eclipse. This was an eclipse that, well, in the July 1990 edition of Sky and Telescope, described it as an eclipse that would be elusive. It was going to pass over Siberia and the Aleutian Islands. That's a great place to take the wife and kids, right, for vacation. Low clouds and fog being major obstacles. Your best bet, the magazine said, would be to observe it from an aircraft. But again, I had no intention of viewing it from an aircraft. But the article also came with this map. And the map was to describe the fact that if you lived in most of the United States, you wouldn't see anything. But if you lived, let's say, out in the western United States, you'd be able to catch the closing stages of the partial eclipse from places like, Seattle or San Francisco, Billings, Montana. You also had a view of it in Honolulu and Anchorage, Alaska. But when I saw this map, I didn't think of it from that point of view. I said, well, look at this. Here's the zone, the path of the total eclipse. It, of course, cut through the Aleutian Islands and then continued southward, ending at local sunset in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And here, I noticed, was Honolulu. And here, I also noticed, was San Francisco. And I said, I wonder if there are going to be any commercial airline flights that are going to be traveling either from Honolulu to San Francisco or from San Francisco to Honolulu that might be in the Pacific Ocean, over the Pacific, at the time that the shadow of the moon was passing by, that would allow them to see the eclipse from the plane. Now, this is 1990. Al Gore had not yet invented the internet, but I did go to my local library. I was living at the time in Levittown, Long Island, and asked the reference librarian for a copy of the OAG, the official airline guide. This was a book that came out every month, a big, thick book, I might add, something like a Brooklyn or Queens phone directory, and it gave you a listing of every airline flight around the world and the schedule of when those flights would take off or land. For example, if you wanted to know how to get to Tokyo, Japan from Omaha, Nebraska, this is the book that you would consult. Every airline, every flight going to Tokyo from Omaha, and the times would be listed as well. So I went to the library and spent a couple of hours reading this book, making notes, trying to find an airline that would go from San Francisco to Honolulu or vice versa. and maybe, just maybe, be in the zone for the eclipse. And I found one. American Trans Air. Now, this airline actually went out of business back in 2008, but in 1990, they were running flights from Honolulu to San Francisco and then back from San Francisco to Honolulu. And I called up the airline, told them about the possibility of seeing a total eclipse. I said, this would be a bonus for your passengers. And after going through the explanation, I guess I was a pretty good salesman. They said, yeah, we'll do it. It's great. It's a great idea. And then I dropped the little thing that I held back until I found out that they were interested. I said, unfortunately, we're going to have to, change the time of the takeoff. And they said, what do you mean? I said, in order for us to be in the correct position over the Pacific Ocean to intercept the shadow of the moon, you are going to have to delay your flight 402 from Honolulu by 41 minutes. Well, that kind of made them think for a few moments, but then they said, it's still worth it. We'll still end up doing it. And so that's what we did. That's what they did. And I ended up going to see this eclipse with my wife and two other people. You see them here in this picture. The fellow who's behind this flag is my friend Sam Storch. This is Craig Small, and this is Craig's flag. This is his lucky charm, so to speak. This flag is a flag that he made of a total eclipse, and he takes it on all the eclipses that he goes to see. I say it's his lucky charm because he's been to 30 or more eclipses. I've lost count now, but he has never been clouded out of a total eclipse, and he says he accredits it to the flag. The flag, as I said, is his lucky charm. My wife, as you see here, holding the flag, Renata and I had been married 6 years, and in this picture, I don't know if you could tell, she's 6 months pregnant with our first son, or our first child, actually. And my son now is 34 years old, and he teaches physics at a high school up here in the Hudson Valley and in Orange County. But back then, these three, along with myself, we got on board a flight from JFK Airport on a Friday night, flew from JFK to San Francisco, got a couple of rooms in the hotel at the airport. Next morning, we got up, went off to the airport, got on board flight 403 from San Francisco to Honolulu, got off the plane in Honolulu, walked around the airport for 45 minutes, got back on the plane after 45 minutes, and took flight 402 back to San Francisco, where we hoped we would encounter the total eclipse. Here you see on the board here, flight 402 to San Francisco, leaving at 3:20, or at least so the people on that flight thought. They didn't know that we were delaying the flight by about 41 minutes so that we would be able to see the solar eclipse. And here is our captain, Captain Bob Leary. Captain Leary said, I'm going to have you tell everybody what we're going to try to do. And I went on the loudspeaker, and there was like a moan when I said that the flight was going to be delayed by 41 minutes. But then I said, hey, you're going to get a chance to see, if we play this out right, a chance to see a total eclipse of the sun. And there were, again, some murmurs of like, oh, wow, that's interesting. But, this is before 9/11. Believe it or not, in 1990, you were able, if you cared to knock on the door of the cockpit and actually walk into the cockpit or the flight deck and talk with the pilots. It was no big deal, but you can't do that obviously now. It's a good thing that I was able to do that back then, though, because after we took off, I noticed on the dashboard 413. Now, I knew that we were going to encounter the shadow of the moon over the Pacific Ocean at 410. This is Greenwich Mean Time, by the way. And yet, instead of 410, I'm seeing 413 on Captain Bob's dashboard. And I'm saying, well, why does it say 413? And he said, I'm glad you mentioned that. I was going to tell you. He said, we had a Continental Airlines flight cut in front of us, and they took off, and we were delayed a couple, 3 minutes. He said, so we're going to get to that spot in the Pacific Ocean that you want for the eclipse, but we're not going to get there at 410. We're going to get there at 413. That's okay, isn't it? He must have seen my face blanch, drain of blood at that moment. Uh, I said, well, Captain Bob, uh, we got to be there at 4:10. If we're there at 4:13, the shadow of the moon, which is traveling thousands of miles an hour, will have already passed that particular point in the Pacific Ocean, and we'll miss out on the total eclipse. And so Captain Bob looked at me and said, so what you're saying is we're going to have to make up 3 minutes? I said, yeah, can you do it? And what he did was he flew down to 26,000 feet in a little used airway. And then, as he said, using his words, we're going pedal to the metal to make up those 3 minutes that we had missed thanks to that Continental Airlines flight. Here is the video, the beginning of a video that was taken by my friend Sam Storch. Would we get there in time to capture the view of the total eclipse of the sun? Well, you're about to see whether or not we would do that. And you're also going to hear in the background people. This was a flight that had about 300 people on board. It was an L-1011 jet. And people were, standing in the aisle 3 and 4 deep, looking through the windows on the port side, the left-hand side of the plane, out the window toward the sun as we watched for the eclipse going into totality. Here's what we saw.
There's Corona. There it is.
To see a total eclipse of the sun from an altitude of 26,000 feet. That was an amazing, amazing spectacle. I took this photograph with my camera, a Nikkormat camera body, and a 500 millimeter lens of the diamond ring as the sun began to emerge. This picture was taken by Craig with a wide angle lens, and you can see the shadow of the moon, this giant shadow, darkening the clouds below us. There you see in the middle a view of the corona of the totally eclipsed sun. After the eclipse was over and when we landed in San Francisco, Captain Bob and his navigator, Frank Thomas, and the rest of the flight crew posed for a shot with Craig's eclipse flag. And I might also point out that there were people on board that flight who, they're not really all that interested in the eclipse. They were much more interested, it seems, in seeing the movie, the Oscar-winning movie from 1989 that they were showing on board the flight, Driving Miss Daisy. And Sam made a comment to a reporter from the New York Times later. He said, I don't know where they were driving her, and I don't care where they were driving her. I'm just glad that they got her there before the total phase of the eclipse. Totality arrived 5 minutes after the end of the movie. A year later, in 1991, the eclipse that many eclipse watchers called the big one, because this eclipse, July 1991, would be the longest total eclipse. Totality would last almost 7 minutes, longer than any other total eclipse until the year 2150. This eclipse would take a track from the Pacific into Mexico, and where these red asterisks are was where the area of greatest eclipse would be, where the eclipse would last a few seconds shy of 7 minutes. 7 minutes of totality. But I wasn't there. I was way over here toward the beginning of the total eclipse, because there the path of totality passed over the big island of Hawaii. And there was a special eclipse cruise, a cruise that was going to encounter the eclipse off of the west coast of the big island. And there you see in the ad, Joe Rayo, meteorologist, will position the SS Independence, that was the name of our ship, for the greatest possibility of seeing the spectacle. When we arrived in Honolulu, myself and my wife, we immediately made a beeline to the National Weather Service office, where we met with the MIC, the meteorologist in charge. Again, this was Hans Rosenthal, who would keep us abreast of the weather during the days leading up to the eclipse. And you could see that even in Hawaii, they wear those garish Hawaiian shirts. And Hans was very helpful as you will soon find out. The big island of Hawaii is really nothing more than a giant volcanic cone, and the trade winds blow from the east. And so, the trade winds blow from the east, they interact with the giant volcano peaks, Mauna Loa and Mauna Kea. The air is forced upward along the one side of the volcanic peaks, and the atmosphere is suddenly drained of all of the moisture, which translates into clouds and also translates into rain. If you ever go to Hilo, Hawaii, which is on the far eastern end of the island, they get like 200 inches of rain a year. It rains almost every day. But on the western side of the island, as the air is blowing down slope of the mountains and the volcanic peaks, the air is dried out by compression. And as a result, the clouds disappear, the rain disappears, we're in the rain shadow. And so, on this side of the island, it's usually sunny. Since the trade winds blow in July, the month of the eclipse, 95% of the time, the promos were for a 95% probability of clear weather on the day of the eclipse. 95%. Wow. But two things happened before the eclipse. One happened a month before, not meteorological, but geophysical. A tremendous volcanic eruption in the Philippines, Mount Pinatubo, which sent a tremendous cloud of ash and dust, an aerosol cloud, into the atmosphere. And that cloud enshrouded the earth. That means that the deep blue skies that we were promised in Hawaii for the eclipse, well, the skies were going to be actually rather hazy for the eclipse. The one nice thing about it was that at sunrise and sunset, we got some spectacular colors, beautiful red, beet red, if you will, at sunrise and sunset. But again, the skies were more hazy than clear blue during the middle part of the day. Now, the other side of the coin was the weather. I said 95% of the time the trade winds blow and you get bright sunny weather. Well, unfortunately, this was one of the 5% times when we had something called a tut, a tropical upper tropospheric trough, which sat over the Big Island on the morning of the eclipse. This disturbance was to cause cloud cover, extensive cloud cover, and also brought even a few scattered showers. And here I am on board this deck of the ship, the person who was entrusted to move the ship into the clearest and best spot to see the eclipse. And I'm underneath clouds. A few hours before the eclipse was to begin, it was drizzling on our ship, on our SS Independence. People in the years that followed asked me, were you frightened? Were you frightened about all of this, that the weather had turned sour? And here you were, promising 1,000 people on board the ship that you were going to move them to the best spot to see the eclipse? Joe, were you frightened? I said, frightened? You're listening to a man who has laughed in the face of death, sneered at doom, chuckled at catastrophe. I was petrified. But I did make a phone call to Hans Rosenthal at the Weather Service, and he said, we're seeing on the satellite pictures a hole in the clouds developing about 40 nautical miles to your southwest. If I were you, I would tell the captain to move the ship and turn it toward that hole, that direction. It may be your salvation. You may just be able to eke out some clear weather for the eclipse. So I told the captain. The captain immediately turned the ship toward the southwest, and at full bore, 27 knots, we headed in the direction of that hole. And sure enough, at sunrise, we were under generally clear skies. And we also were watching, and you see me and the back of my sister's head. My sister, of course, back then had a lot of hair, as you could see. But we were looking at the approach of another ship. That ship was the SS Constitution, the sister ship of the Independence. You see, the ship that we were on sold out so quickly, there was a long waiting list. And so Hawaii Cruises said, well, why don't we put them on a second ship? And there you see the second ship off in the distance, the Constitution. We were on the Independence, nicknamed the Indy, and there you see the Connie. And we ended up docking, or the Constitution docked about a mile off of where we were. And so now both ships with 2,000 people, one on 1,000 on one ship, 1,000 on the other, awaiting the start of the eclipse. Here you see from our ship people with their telescopes and cameras and special welder's glass to look at the partial phases of the eclipse. And then came totality. And admittedly, it was a little hazy as we had expected, and there were some thin, high clouds. But here you see the corona of the sun, the beautiful corona. Here you see a couple of bright stars which popped out during the total phase of the eclipse. And down here, you see this band of black cloud. That, unfortunately, were the cloud cover that sat over the Big Island, ruining the view, sadly, for those who were stuck on the Big Island of Hawaii for the eclipse. So they got skunked, but fortunately, because of our maneuverability of the ship, we were able to see the eclipse. Probably the one thing that really stood out was what was called the seahorse prominence, this tremendous cloud of hydrogen gas lifting off of the sun's surface and looking very much like a seahorse, a beautiful electric pink or reddish coloration during the 4 minutes of totality that we saw from our ship. We also had celebrities on board. On the left, you see Frederick Pohl. He was probably one of the most noteworthy science fiction writers at that time, next to perhaps Isaac Asimov. And he was on the ship. Also on the ship in the middle is George Keen, who during that 1979 eclipse took a picture of the totality from Montana, and that picture ended up on the front page, the cover of Life magazine. And George was there to explain to everybody, all the passengers, how you could best photograph the solar eclipse. But the one celebrity that stands out among all the others was this man on my, as you see on the right, that was Michael Collins. The name may be familiar to you, and it'll be more familiar when I say that it was astronaut Michael Collins. He was the man who traveled on Apollo 11, the first manned mission to put men on the moon. And during that cruise, I got to know Mike Collins very well. One morning, I even had a chance to sit down with him for breakfast. Many refer to him as the forgotten astronaut because he was left behind, left by himself, circling the moon in the command module, while his colleagues, Armstrong and Aldrin, cavorted on the lunar surface. To me, though, I was impressed by how gentle he was. No envy, no jealousy, no great desire to be any greater than he was. And he certainly was among the greatest of all the people I've ever met in my life. I consider Mike Collins to be among the greatest of all. He passed away a few years ago at the ripe old age of 90 years old. Then in 1998, I was on shipboard again. This was Celebrity Cruise Lines running an eclipse cruise on their ship, the Galaxy. This eclipse crossed through the Pacific Ocean, through the Panama Canal, across northern Colombia, and we parked our ship right next to the island of Montserrat, where we would see a nearly 4 minute total eclipse. But several months before this eclipse, I had the great privilege of writing an article for Reader's Digest. It was a kind of a family values article, and it spoke of how my grandfather took me to see my very first total eclipse and how he got me started on eclipse chasing. And I mentioned, of course, the episode with the salt and pepper shakers. Now, when you write for Reader's Digest, a magazine that at its peak was read by 26 million people in 19 languages all over the world, you have to get some feedback. And I did get quite a few people who wrote to me and sent me emails. I even got a couple of phone calls from people telling me how much they enjoyed my story in Reader's Digest about the eclipse. But the one correspondence that stood out was from Miss Barbara M. Vargo of Rapid City, South Dakota, who wrote, "I was deeply touched by your story in Reader's Digest. I, too, saw the 1925 eclipse like your grandfather from the Upper West Side of Manhattan." And then she said, "I'm enclosing something here that I've been carrying around with me for quite some time. I've decided to pass it on to you, as I think you might make a better home for it." And what was it? It was a filter that sold for 10 cents back in 1925 that she used to look at the 1925 eclipse, and now she was sending it over to me. And when I got on board the Galaxy, the ship, for the February 1998 total eclipse, I carried that with me instead of my usual special filters and welder's glass, and I used that as a tribute to my grandfather. I watched the solar eclipse then on board the ship using Ms. Vargo's filter that she had sent to me all those years ago. The eclipse itself in 98 was spectacular. We had long coronal streamers that you can see extending up to the upper part and lower part of the sun, but also As soon as the sun went into totality, what immediately popped into view in what was otherwise a few moments ago a daytime sky, the planet Mercury above and the planet Jupiter below. When you have a total eclipse, and only when you have a total eclipse, you can see the brighter stars and planets suddenly emerge in a dark, eclipsed sky. In 2008, Glenn, remember Glenn, my good friend, he took a page out of my book. Remember how I coerced American Transair to change their itinerary to see a total eclipse? Glenn found a company called, in Dusseldorf, Germany, Air Events Polarflug. And what they do during the summertime, this company, they fly from Dusseldorf and take a flight all the way up to the North Pole. They don't land, but they fly up to the North Pole, circle around the pole a few times, and then they fly back to Dusseldorf. It's a 12-hour flight, but you get the chance of being able to see out your window some of the beautiful Arctic scenery. You have a chance to say, I flew up to the North Pole. And Glenn pointed out to the people at Polarflug there was going to be a total eclipse of the sun near the North Pole in August 1st, 2008. And hey, why don't you guys consider intercepting that eclipse? And on top of that, Glenn, by now, August 1st, 2008, he had started and learned how to write up flight plans for airborne expeditions to see eclipses. And he said, I could write you a flight plan. And indeed, he submitted the flight plan. The people at the company, Polarflug, said, this is fantastic. We'll do it. And that's what they did. They dedicated their August 1st flight to the North Pole to also see the total eclipse of the sun. And 10 days before this eclipse, something unusual happened. First of all, here you see Glenn. He was actually hired by Polarflug and the airline, Air Berlin, LTU, because that's the only way he could have gotten into the flight deck or cockpit for this eclipse. So here he is setting up his equipment, and he was going to take the equipment and aim it out the window in the cockpit area to see totality. But 10 days before, Polarflug said, we're going to get a lot of publicity here in Europe, but nobody in America knows what we're going to be doing. We'd love to have somebody in America promote this. Do you know anybody who could do that for us? So Glenn called me up and said, you work for a TV station, don't you? You have media connections. Can you help us out? And he said, if you do that, well, you can go on board. You can come on board. Considering the fact that it costs for a window seat to see both the North Pole and the eclipse, something like $10,000 to $12,000. And here I was being offered a chance to be on board that flight for nothing. What could I do? How could I get publicity? Well, as is the case now, as well as back then, I was a member of the American Museum of Natural History, Hayden Planetarium. I approached the magazine of the museum, Natural History, and said, hey, guess what? I'm going to have a chance to fly up to the North Pole and along the way see a total eclipse. Would that make an interesting article for you? Feature article? And they said, yes. If you're going to go, we'd love for you to write about it. I told Glenn. Glenn told the people at Polarflug. And the next day, I got a call from Glenn, said, congratulations, welcome aboard. You're on that flight. And here's my boarding pass. And you could see that we flew out of Dusseldorf and we were flying toward a fictitious point, that particular point being along the path of the total eclipse. And here's my window. Well, I wasn't given a window seat because that was already paid for by people, $10,000, $12,000, and there weren't any window seats, but there was a view out of the small circular window that was on the escape hatch. And they said, you can look out the window there at the eclipse. I said to myself, how am I going to see much of anything? And I wanted to take pictures. Would I be able to take good pictures through that little circular, only 3 inches in diameter? Well, guess what? I was. Here's one of the pictures I took for the magazine article. And after we landed back in Dusseldorf, here is the eclipse chasers, my fellow eclipse chasers, about 100 people on board that flight. There I am giving the thumbs up. When I got back home, I wrote the article for Natural History magazine, and to this day, I still don't know how it was possible, and I don't know who did it, but somebody read the article and then said, hey, this is worthy of possibly getting an award from the American Astronomical Society, the AAS. And guess what? Whoever it was submitted the article, and I did indeed get the Popular Writing Award from the Solar Physics Division of the American Astronomical Society for my article, Shades of Glory, my whirlwind tour to the North Pole and back for 175 seconds of totality. And guess what? The award came with a very handsome honorarium, which paid for my flight to Dusseldorf. I had to pay for that in order to get on board the flight. So basically, this flight cost me, well, I still had to pay for the hotel in Dusseldorf, but still, it cost me practically nothing, or a fraction of what it would have cost if I was actually going and paying out for both the trip to Dusseldorf and being on board that flight. And I owe it all to Glenn. If it weren't for Glenn, I never would have had that opportunity or chance to see that total eclipse. In 2016, there would be an eclipse in March of that year over Indonesia, but I saw no reason to go to Indonesia. I looked at the flight, I looked at the totality path, noticed that it was passing between Hawaii and Alaska. And as I did in 1990, I did a little bit of research and found an airline, Alaska Airline. They had a flight 870, that was going to leave Anchorage, Alaska, fly to Honolulu. I pointed out to them that, hey, if you delay the flight by 25 minutes, we have a chance to see, everybody on that board that flight, a total eclipse of the sun. Are you interested? And sure enough, after I told them what we did in 1990 with American Transvair, they said, yeah, sure, we'll do it. Glenn was kind enough to write up the flight plan. Here was the news, part of the news release Alaska Airlines sent out, telling everybody about what they had planned to do. The night before, here is the flight plan that Glenn wrote that was used by American Transair. The night before, Captain Hal Anderson, who was going to fly our plane into totality, we met with him at a local restaurant, myself and about 10 other of my Eclipse buddies who went with me on board that flight, and my wife as well, instead of Indonesia. Here you see me giving last minute flight and weather informations to Captain Anderson. And we covered that on News 12. I don't know if you remember it. Those of you who had News 12, you may have seen it. If not, here is the report that aired about my adventure on board Flight 870 to see a total eclipse of the sun.
Now to a News 12 special report. Not many people get the chance to see a solar eclipse from the air, but our chief meteorologist convinced a major airline to alter the path of one of its regularly scheduled flights to give passengers and crew a chance to experience an incredible celestial sight. Here's Joe Rayo's remarkable story, Into the Eclipse.
Oh my God, look at it. Here comes the shadow. Look at that. It's like a tornado. Oh my God, here we go.
Exclamations of wonder from a person witnessing a sight that few people in their lifetime ever get a chance to see. This is the shadow of the moon streaking silently over the Pacific Ocean at 7,000 miles per hour, about to rendezvous with a commercial jet aircraft just prior to the start of the most awe-inspiring sight the heavens can offer, a total eclipse of the sun.
Totality! Totality!
But it was the circumstances of how this flight came about that garnered national attention.
We are about to embark on a trip that a lot of people are calling historic here. Now, a second ago, I spoke to the man who actually did this whole process. A year ago, Joe Rayo noticed that this path of the eclipse was going to cross between Hawaii and Alaska, and he contacted Alaska Air to make this special flight happen.
And that's how, in the dead of winter, I found myself heading to Ted Stevens International Airport in beautiful Anchorage, Alaska, on a day where the Alaskan mountains sparkled and plane tickets promised Hawaii. Waiting for me at the gate was Captain Hal Anderson of Alaska Airlines, who was going to pilot our journey into darkness.
It's a rare privilege to see a total eclipse, particularly from 37,000 feet.
I think Alaska Airlines should be congratulated because most other airlines just give you an in-flight movie. We're going to go one better than that, much better than that. We're going to give you a chance to see something you may never see again, a total solar eclipse. That's the promise I made to all the passengers as we boarded a packed 737 jet en route to Honolulu, where the in-flight entertainment began with a pair of Eclipse safety glasses. And soon, everyone on board began to get into place for the big show in the sky. The dark silhouette of the moon was about to begin crossing directly in front of the disk of the sun.
First, just a small bite cutting into the bottom of the sun. And as the minutes ticked off, that bite became progressively larger, and larger, and larger still, cutting the sun down to a narrow crescent. In the final moments before totality, just like curtain time before a Broadway play, the light rapidly dimmed. Then, 700 miles north of Honolulu, the main event. Sun, moon, plane, perfectly aligning for a perfect moment.
Perfect timing. Perfect timing. A once in a lifetime view.
Time just stopped. The eclipse was frozen above us, like a phenomenal photograph pasted on the dome of the sky. The incredible corona, the crown of the sun, was now in full view. Study of this solar atmosphere is one of the main scientific benefits from an eclipse. More is being learned about the corona all the time. Some believe it may have an effect on the Earth's weather. But time was not standing still. After just 113 seconds, the moon's movement brought forth a second sunrise, ending the late afternoon darkness that had stretched across the horizon. And the passengers were still in awe.
You could see that thing coming at you, both sides of it, like a blanket being thrown toward your face.
I have never seen one before, and it was spectacular, especially when the moon was totally over the sun.
Spectacular and eerie at the same time. Most on board soon came to realize that for them, such an amazing sight may never come again, proving that age-old saying is true. Why worry about your destination when the journey looks like this? Joe Rayo, News 12, airborne above the North Pacific.
Well, I really don't know what else I could possibly do or say to all of you to try to convince you to see the total eclipse coming up in 3 weeks instead of just staying and seeing the partial from here in New York, in Westchester and the Hudson Valley. But let's hope that the weather is clear. The next time we will have a chance this close to our area for such an event won't be until May of 2079. I don't know about you. I don't intend to be here 55 years from now. So take full advantage of it. I hope all of you get a chance to see it. I hope it was interesting for the last hour and 20 some odd minutes. But I hope you enjoyed it. And if you have any questions, I'll take them now.
Thank you, Joe. That was great. That was just you're a great storyteller, and you have a great story to tell. Let's see if there's anyone in the chat. Actually, no questions in the chat, just some thank yous. Okay, is there a basic equipment list?
For viewing the partial phases, either project the image through a pinhole, which you can do as those kids were, as you saw at the beginning, through a pinhole that you could put a box over your head and have the pinhole shine through the box and onto the opposite side of the box, where you can have a white sheet of paper and see a miniature view of the eclipse going on. Can you wear glasses? You should use the special solar eclipse glasses. Do not use sunglasses, because even though the sunglasses may diminish the brightness of the sun, the infrared and ultraviolet radiations are still coming through those sunglasses and burning your eyes without you immediately being aware of it. But if you know someplace that is giving out these special glasses, I believe the New Rochelle Library is going to be doing that. There are many other libraries around who have been getting glasses through a special grant by the American Astronomical Society. Or if you can't get it that way, and if you want to order them yourself, just go on Google and type eclipse glasses or solar eclipse glasses, and you will be able to order them through Amazon. And they only cost $1 or $2 at most. Those are the glasses, those special glasses certified to view the eclipse. Somebody asked, where's the best place to see the eclipse? I mentioned at the start, you got to go upstate New York. If you travel out of the Hudson Valley and get on Interstate 87 and go straight north along I-87, past Albany, past Saratoga Springs, up to the town of Schroon Lake. That's at the base, the beginning of the Adirondacks. That's about 4 hours away. But what's 4 hours? It'll be 4 hours to get you into the zone of totality. Other cities that are going to be in the totality path, as I mentioned: Niagara Falls, Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, Plattsburgh, Watertown. If you go online and type in Eclipse of the Sun, April the 8th, 2024, there are numerous different websites, more than you can count. And each one of those sites will show you maps of where the eclipse will be total, including right here in New York State. The people at the I Love New York committee are trying to urge people from other parts of the country: see the eclipse, stay for New York, because all kinds of great things to see in upstate New York for people who come to see the solar eclipse. So a lot of things to do, a lot of things to prepare for, but it's only 3 weeks away, and I don't know about you, but I'm counting down the hours till that great event. Well, anyway, I'm going to be leaving you now. And if you're interested, on YouTube, I joined a friend of mine who is a retired TV meteorologist. His name is Joe Chiaffi. He used to do the weather on Pix 11. And at 8 o'clock, we're going to do a show. We call it the Joe and Joe Show. I gave him top billing. And we're going to talk about weather, the weather for this week, and the weather maybe for the coming days ahead, and maybe even touch upon the weather that might be around for the eclipse. But we do that for about 45 minutes to an hour. We do that most weeknights, and tonight we're going to be doing it at 8 o'clock. And oh my goodness, it's 7:59.
You have a minute.
I've got exactly 1 minute. But I thank you all for coming. I thank again the Ossining Library, the John Hart Library, and the New Rochelle Library for inviting me to talk. No, I am not doing a tour for this one. I'm going to go and try to see this with my members of my family, and I don't know where I'm going to be. Depending upon the weather, I might be down in Texas or Little Rock, Arkansas, or Syracuse or Plattsburgh. Wherever the weather looks clear, I'm going in that direction, and I'll cancel all the hotel reservations I made for the other spots along the eclipse track.
Wonderful. Well, we look forward to hearing about this eclipse next year, or next time there's well, I don't want to wait to 2079, but this was wonderful. I hope everyone enjoyed as I did. And thank you for joining us. And Joe, thank you again. And you better go. It's 8 o'clock. Okay, thank you everyone for joining us. And remember, to safely view the eclipse, please do use eclipse glasses. As Joe mentioned, the Rochelle Public Library will be giving them out. We're going to try to host a viewing. Right outside the library is a park, and I'm sure many other libraries also have a supply. So check with your local library. Good night, everyone.